On her wedding day, a bride is abandoned by her millionaire fiancé. Years later, he sees her with triplets and takes her to court. Hello and welcome to Untold Tales. Enjoy the story and don't forget to hit subscribe and activate notifications. On what was supposed to be the happiest day of her life, Grace found herself in disbelief and heartbreak. It was her wedding day, the day she had dreamed of for so long. But instead of walking down the aisle, she was left questioning everything. Her fiancé, Daniel, the wealthy millionaire who had promised her a lifetime of love and happiness, was nowhere to be found. Desperate, Grace called him, begging him not to leave her. She reminded him of all the plans and promises they had made for their future. But Daniel's response was cold and distant, as if it were just another normal day. He gave excuses, saying he needed to focus on his business and couldn't go through with the wedding. Grace's hand shook as she gripped the phone, trying to hold on to the hope that he would remember his promises. But Daniel remained unmoved, repeating his excuses to refuse to marry her. It became painfully clear that he had already made up his mind. In that moment, she realized he never truly intended to marry her. The realization hit Grace hard. Daniel had used her for his own pleasure, for his fun, and now he was discarding her like she meant nothing. All the promises he had made, all the dreams he had painted of their future and children, shattered in that moment. The man she thought loved her had abandoned her at the most crucial moment, leaving her not only heartbroken, but also alone to face the world. With no job, no connections, and nowhere to go, Grace had no choice but to pack her things and leave behind the high society world she had once been a part of. She rented a small, run-down apartment on the outskirts of the city, far from the life of luxury she had known. One morning, about a month after the wedding disaster, Grace found herself sitting in the bathroom, clutching a pregnancy test. Her hands shook as she focused on the small plastic stick. Slowly, a faint second line began to appear. She was pregnant. It was a moment of disbelief, mixed with a surge of panic. She was going to be a mother, her mind racing with fear and uncertainty. What would life look like as a single mother? Could she raise a child on her own? There was no one to turn to, no one to share this life-changing news with. Daniel had made his choice, abandoning her without looking back. There was no way she'd let him back into her life. He didn't deserve to know. This was her journey now, and she would face it alone. Weeks turned into months, and her body continued to change. Each doctor's visit brought new revelations, but none more shocking than the day she learned she wasn't just carrying one child. She was expecting triplets. Grace stared at the doctor in disbelief, her heart racing with both awe and fear. 3 babies. How was she going to handle this? The months flew by in a blur, and soon the day arrived. Grace found herself in a hospital bed, her body worn out from labor. She could barely comprehend the sight before her. 3 tiny, fragile newborns placed gently in her arms. She looked at each of their little faces, overwhelmed by a fierce, protective love. She named them Emma, Ethan, and Evan. But as the joy of becoming a mother filled her heart, the reality of her situation set in. Grace was now a single mother of 3, with no support from Daniel and nowhere near enough income to cover the rising expenses for 3 newborns. Grace's life became an endless cycle of exhaustion after the birth of her triplets. Caring for 3 newborns was overwhelming. Feeding, changing diapers, soothing cries. It felt like a never-ending marathon. Her tiny apartment barely had enough space for her and the babies, but it was all she could afford. Grace juggled 2 jobs, working long hours during the day and late into the night. There were moments when she felt like collapsing, her body worn out from lack of sleep and stress. But she pushed through, even on nights when she skipped meals just to make sure her babies had enough to eat. Financially, things were brutal. Every paycheck barely covered the rent and groceries, let alone diapers, formula, and baby clothes. There were days she stared at her empty wallet, wondering how she would keep going. Raising triplets as a single mother wasn't easy, but she pressed on, determined to give them a better life. Every time she looked at them, her heart swelled with love and purpose. Every giggle, every smile from her 3 little ones filled her with joy and made all the struggles worthwhile. Grace poured herself into raising them, doing everything she could to ensure they never felt the lack of anything. She worked long hours, juggling 2 jobs, and somehow found the strength to keep going. She wanted to give them everything, a good future, stability, and love. As the triplets grew 3-year-old, Grace couldn't help but notice how much they resembled Daniel. Their eyes, their facial features, even the way their hair curled reminded her of him. It was painful, seeing him in them every day. The memories of his love and broken promises still lingered in her heart, but she reminded herself of the truth. Daniel had revealed his real self on that wedding day, walking away from her and their future. He would never be a part of their lives, and he didn't deserve to be. By the time the triplets turned 5, Grace had adjusted to their growing independence. They could do some basic things on their own, which allowed her a bit more time to work and earn more for their future. One evening, as part of their usual routine, Grace took the triplets to the park. It was their favorite time of the day, the only break she allowed herself after juggling work and parenting. Suddenly, a familiar voice pierced the tranquility of the park with her name. The voice was one she had once loved and trusted. She hadn't heard it in years. Slowly, Grace turned, dreading the sight she had hoped never to face again. It was Daniel. He stood just a few feet away, looking almost the same, tall, well-dressed, but colder. His expression was unreadable as he gave her a brief glance, then his eyes shifted to the triplets. One by one, he studied them, taking in every detail. Grace could already sense what was going through his mind. "They're not yours," Grace blurted out, her voice sharp and defensive, the words escaping before she could even think. It was a lie, quick and instinctive. But Daniel wasn't a fool. He kept his gaze on the children, studying them closely. The blue eyes, the wavy blonde curly hair, the familiar smiles, all matched to his own. "They're mine. I have rights to my children, and I want them," Daniel said, his voice calm but firm. Grace's anger flared, emotions surging through her. How could he be so shameless, so selfish? He had abandoned her when she was pregnant, leaving her to face everything alone, never once checking on her or the triplets. He hadn't been there during the hardest times, not a single visit, not a shred of concern for how they managed. And now, when the children were growing, thriving, he had the audacity to claim them as his. The thought of him wanting her children made her heart ache with disbelief. With tears in her eyes and a quiver in her voice, Grace confronted him, desperate for answers. Why had he abandoned her? Why had he refused to marry her? Daniel offered the same rehearsed excuses he had given on that fateful day, words that were as empty now as they had been then. His response was a sham, a feeble attempt to justify his selfishness. It was clear to Grace that he didn't care how hollow his claims sounded. He just wanted to assert his so-called rights. Just then, the door to a sleek car parked nearby opened, and a tall, confident woman stepped out. She was dressed in a stylish, modern outfit, exuding self-assurance as she walked toward Daniel. She slipped her arm through his elbow with ease, her smile bright as she glanced between Daniel and Grace. Daniel turned slightly toward Grace. "This is Monica, my fiancé," he said, the introduction as casual as if they were discussing the weather. Grace felt her chest tighten. She struggled to maintain her composure as she forced a formal smile, though it barely touched her eyes. "How long have you been together?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Monica's smile didn't waver. "About 6 years now." The words hit Grace like a slap in the face. 6 years. Daniel had been cheating on her while they were still together. The truth of why he had left her, why he had refused to marry her, now came crashing down. It wasn't about his career or his business. It was about Monica. All the excuses, all the lies, everything he had told her that day, they were nothing more than a cover for his betrayal. Grace's mind raced, her heart aching with the weight of it all. The betrayal wasn't just about him abandoning her at the altar. It was the knowledge that he had been living a double life, all while she was left alone to carry the burden of raising his children. And now, standing in front of her with this new woman on his arm, he had the nerve to claim rights to the children he had never cared about. Her thoughts shattered as Monica's voice cut through the tension. "Daniel and I want these little ones in our lives." "They're not yours," Grace shot back, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. "You have no right to—" "Actually, we do," Monica interrupted, her tone silky smooth. "Daniel is their father, and as his wife I'll be—" Well, I guess you could call me their stepmother." Grace felt her world tilt on its axis. She had thought Daniel's reappearance would be her biggest challenge, but now Monica stood before her, twisting the knife deeper. Daniel, who had been silent until now, stepped forward, his gaze fixed intently on Grace. "We want to make this work, Grace. For the triplets. For our children." The audacity of his words ignited a firestorm of anger within her. For the past 5 years, she had fought tooth and nail to provide the best life for her children, and now Daniel expected to waltz back in with his fiancée, as if he could just take over. Grace refused to welcome them into her children's lives, her voice steady yet fierce. "You may have made your choices, Daniel, but my children are not bargaining chips. They will never be part of your life, not after what you did." Then Grace walked over to the triplets and gently took their hands, saying, "Okay, that's enough playing for today. It's time to go home." She gathered them close to her side, instinctively shielding them from Daniel and Monica. The warmth of their small bodies pressed against her gave her strength, even as anxiety twisted in her gut. Once they were inside their apartment, she knelt down to their level, distracting them with playful questions and gentle laughter. But as she tucked them into their evening routine, helping them wash their hands, brushing their hair, and reading a bedtime story, the thought of Daniel wanting to claim them lingered in the back of her mind like a dark cloud. She knew he wouldn't back down. He would do everything in his power to take her children away from her. She can't sleep that night with the thoughts. A week passed, and Daniel showed up again. This time, he wasn't alone. He brought a lawyer. Grace's heart sank as he handed her a set of legal papers. The words, "child custody," hit her like a punch to the gut, knocking the wind from her. For a moment their eyes met. Daniel's expression was cold, unfeeling. His voice was just as sharp. "I'm serious about this, Grace. I want my children, and I'm going to fight for custody." Grace wasted no time. She called her lawyer immediately. They spent hours on the phone, discussing every possibility, every avenue to protect her children. By the time she hung up, her body was drained, but her resolve was stronger than ever. She would fight for her triplets, no matter what it took. 2 weeks later, Grace arrived at the courthouse. Daniel was already there, looking determined, his lawyer at his side. The first custody hearing was about to begin. The courtroom felt like a battlefield. Daniel's lawyer tore into Grace's life, painting her as an unfit mother. They scrutinized her finances, highlighting her low income and small apartment. They emphasized that she had no family support. It was as if every sacrifice she had made was being twisted into a weapon against her. Grace clenched her fists under the table, anger boiling inside her. How dare they question her as a mother? How dare they judge her for doing her best, for raising her children alone while Daniel had walked away without a second thought? Then her lawyer stood up, calm yet resolute. He pointed out that Grace had been the sole caregiver for the children over the past 5 years, providing them with unwavering love, stability, and care entirely on her own. Despite facing financial difficulties, the children were thriving, healthy and happy. He emphasized that Grace had never sought any help from Mr. Carter during this time and had managed everything on her own. The judge, a stern-looking man in his 50s, listened carefully. His eyes narrowed as he looked at both sides. When he finally spoke, his words were measured. He praised Grace for her dedication and acknowledged her efforts in raising the children alone. But he also acknowledged Daniel's rights as their father. The decision was bittersweet. Grace would retain full custody, but Daniel was granted visitation rights. He could meet the children every weekend. Relief flooded Grace, but she knew this wasn't over. Daniel was now going to be a part of their lives, whether she liked it or not. Every weekend, Daniel came to pick up the triplets. He took them to the zoo, to sports games, to amusement parks. He made an effort to bond with them, learning their favorite things and making the most of the time he was given. Daniel was cold toward Grace, not talking to her or showing any expression, but she noticed the warmth he had for the children. For them, he was a new, exciting presence in their lives, a man they knew as a big friend, unaware that he was their father. Grace watched them return from their weekends together, full of stories and excitement. They talked endlessly about their adventures, their eyes lighting up as they recounted their time with Daniel. It stung, but Grace kept her composure. She knew that, despite everything, she had to keep her focus on what mattered most, her children's happiness. Daniel, over time, found a quiet satisfaction in those weekends with the triplets, the joy in their faces, the way they embraced him with excitement. It filled a space in his heart that he hadn't known was empty. But as he watched them thrive under Grace's care, he realized something deeper. These children, so full of life and love, were happy, truly happy. And that happiness was something he couldn't take away from them or from Grace. For the first time, Daniel saw how strong and capable Grace truly was. She had given everything for their children, raised them with love and care that he had never been around to provide. It was then he understood how wrong he had been to abandon her and leave her to face it all alone. He knew that he could never heal the wounds he had caused, but at least he can stop causing more pain. He no longer wanted to fight for custody, no longer wanted to take the children from Grace. The children was her happiness, her world, and he couldn't take that away. Spending weekends with the triplets, seeing their joy and watching them grow, was enough for him. It filled his heart in a way he hadn't expected. But Daniel wasn't finished. Though he knew Grace would never accept his financial help directly, he found another way. Quietly, he began supporting them anonymously. He set up a fund for the children's education, ensuring they would have a future without the financial strain that had always weighed on Grace. He paid for little things here and there, groceries, school supplies, even doctor's bills, all through anonymous donations. As he watched the triplets flourish, knowing he was quietly supporting their well-being, his heart was finally at peace. Grace had her happiness, and he had found his place in their lives. No longer as a threat, but as a father content with the moments he had, knowing they were in good hands. If you enjoyed this story, don't leave without hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel. Your support means the world and helps us bring you more powerful, emotional stories like this one. By subscribing, you'll be the first to experience our latest content, and together, we can grow a community that values heart, resilience, and real-life struggles. Join us, share with others, and let's make every story a journey worth taking.